The wind, a sallow breath across a cracked lip of earth. Dust, finer than ground bone, swirled in listless eddies, coating the gray-green of struggling sage, settling like a shroud on the warped timbers of Havenwood. The sun, a molten coin pinned to a bleached sky, offered no comfort, only a relentless, baking scrutiny. They said the devil danced in the heat haze shimmering above the dry creek bed, a creek that had not sung its stony song in 3 seasons. And they said Ilara, who lived where the tortured scrublands clawed at the foot of Blackwood Ridge, was his consort. Her small stone-chinked cabin, hunkered low against the biting winds of winter and the desiccating breath of this endless summer, was a punctuation mark of suspicion at the edge of their fear. Windows, like shadowed eyes, watched the town that watched her back. Inside, the air was cooler, touched with the scent of dried herbs, of damp earth she coaxed into life in shaded pots, of a quiet defiance. She moved with a stillness that was its own language, her hands gnarled as ancient roots, deft and knowing. Today, they sorted feverfew, its tiny white faces a stark rebellion against the scorched world outside. A memory sharp as a shard of glass pricked her. The mayor's wife, face contorted, pointing a trembling finger. She looked on my cow, and it soured its milk. Witch! The cow had drunk from a scummy trough, but blame, like the dust, settled where it was most convenient. Ilara had said nothing then, her silence their canvas for a darker portrait. She had simply turned, walked away, the word witch clinging to her like burrs. Now the feverfew, good for headaches, for fevers, for calming a troubled spirit. The irony was a bitter herb on her tongue. The town suffered, children coughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the wind's lament. Old folks withered in their chairs, their stories drying up with the wells. Each misfortune, from a stillborn calf to a rotten fence post, found its way to her door, a whispered curse, a stone thrown in the dead of night. She swept the stones away, mended her small hurts, and talked to the struggling mint in its clay pot. They thirst, she'd murmur, her voice raspy from disuse, for more than water. A hawk circled overhead, a dark stroke against the pale canvas of the sky. It saw everything, the barren fields, the listless cattle, the lone figure of Ilara, moving from her herb garden to the small spring-fed seep she fiercely protected, a tiny oasis of green in a world turning to ochre and despair. She carried water not in buckets, but in a goatskin bag, the way her grandmother had, a woman who'd also known the sting of suspicion, the weight of names she hadn't chosen. This spring, her secret was the only magic she possessed, and it was the magic of persistence, of listening to the earth's faint heartbeat when everyone else heard only its dying groan. The town did not know of this spring. They imagined her conjuring water from dust, or calling it from clouds that never came. Their fear was a more potent brew than any she could concoct. She laid the feverfew on a drying rack, the scent a fragile shield against the bitterness that sometimes threatened to crack her composure. Let them whisper, let them fear. The earth still turned. The herbs still grew, if one knew where to look, how to listen. And in the deep quiet of her isolation, Ilara listened. She heard the scuttling of a beetle, the sigh of the wind through the parched grass, the distant, desperate prayers of Havenwood. And she heard, beneath it all, the faint, stubborn pulse of life, a rhythm she alone seemed to remember. Her cabin was not just a refuge, it was a testament to the enduring, the unyielding, the things that grew in the shadows, nurtured by silence and a knowing hand. The sun began its slow, fiery descent, painting the dust clouds in hues of blood and regret. Another day burned away, and Ilara, a silhouette against the fading light, stood by her door, a sentinel of a forgotten faith, the faith in the quiet power of the earth itself. The wind carried the scent of dust, and something else, desperation. It had a scent all its own, sharp, sour, coming closer. Sheriff Marcus Thorne wore his star like a penance. It pressed heavy on his chest, a cold reminder of the order he could no longer maintain, the peace that had fractured and blown away with the last good rain. Havenwood was a tinderbox, and he, its weary guardian, had only an empty bucket. His son Thomas was the spark that threatened to consume everything. 8 years old, a whisper of a boy, now burning with a fire no poultice from Doc Weatherby could quench. The doctor, a man whose knowledge was more comfort than cure, had finally shaken his head, his face etched with a sorrow that mirrored Marcus's own. "I've done all I can, Sheriff. It's in God's hands now." But God, it seemed, had forsaken Havenwood, forsaken them all. The thought was a blasphemy Marcus quickly swallowed, but it lingered, acrid as the smoke from a distant unseen fire. Thomas lay in his small bed, skin stretched taut over his bones, lips cracked and dry. His breath was a shallow, ragged thing, each inhalation a fresh stab in Marcus's heart. Maria, his wife, had wept herself into an exhausted slumber in the chair beside the bed, her hand still clutching Thomas's small, hot one. He looked at them, his family, broken by a force he couldn't fight, a sickness as relentless as the drought. The townsfolk offered platitudes, their eyes filled with a pity that felt like another layer of dust. "He's a strong boy, Sheriff. Prayers for him, Marcus." But behind the sympathy, he saw the fear. If the sheriff's son could be struck down, what hope was there for any of them? The whispers had reached him, of course, about Ilara, the woman on the ridge, the witch. They said she'd soured the wells, blighted the crops, called down this unending dryness. He'd dismissed it as ignorant fear-mongering, the desperate need to find a scapegoat when God or nature turned a cruel face. But now desperation gnawed at the edges of his reason. What if? The question was a dangerous seed. What if she could help? What if the very thing they reviled held the only key? He paced the small confines of his house, the floorboards groaning under his boots like the parched earth outside. He saw Thomas's drawing tacked to the wall, a lopsided sun smiling over a green field, a blue river snaking through it, a child's dream of a world that no longer existed. He remembered Ilara from years past. A quiet woman, rarely seen. Then the talk started. Small things at first. A pie left to cool on a windowsill found spoiled. A chicken taken by a fox. Then bigger things, coinciding with the drought's tightening grip. She became the focus of their collective misery. He'd done nothing to stop it, beyond a gruff word or two about idle gossip. He hadn't believed it. Not really. But he hadn't defended her either. Now the weight of that inaction pressed down on him, heavier than the star. He went to the window, looked out at the dust-choked street. The decision was a poisonous thorn. To seek her out would be to validate the whispers, to admit his own helplessness, the failure of his world's remedies. It would make him a hypocrite, or worse, a fool. But to not go, to watch Thomas fade. He returned to his son's bedside. The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, clouded with fever. A small sound, a whimper, escaped his lips. "Papa, water." Marcus's resolve, already brittle, shattered. He gently brushed the damp hair from Thomas's forehead. "I'll get you water, son, I promise." He looked at Maria's sleeping form, then back at his boy. The badge felt like a brand. He unpinned it, laid it on the small table beside the bed. It gleamed dully in the lamplight, a symbol of an authority that meant nothing here. In this room of fading hope, he walked out into the oppressive heat, the decision made. The path to Blackwood Ridge was steep, untended, like the path to a forbidden place. He didn't care. He would crawl if he had to. The dust swirled around his boots as if trying to reclaim him, to pull him back into the dying heart of Havenwood. But he pushed on, his own heart, a frantic drum against the silence of the blighted land. He was just a man now, a father, walking towards a last desperate chance, towards the woman they called a witch. The knock was hesitant at first, then harder, a fist against the weathered wood of her door, syncopated with the frantic thud of a heart. Ilara didn't startle. She'd felt his approach, a disturbance in the dry air, a tremor of despair rippling through the stillness she cultivated. She'd seen him from her small window, a figure dark against the dying sun, stumbling slightly on the loose scree of the path. The sheriff, Marcus Thorne. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by the harsh light and the heavier burden he carried. She opened the door slowly, not wide, just enough to see and be seen. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. His face was a mask of exhaustion, dust clinging to his sweat-slicked skin, his eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness and fear. He looked, she thought, like the land itself, parched, cracked, desperate for relief. Elara, her name, spoken by him, felt alien. Not the hissed epithet from a shadowed alley, but a plea. She waited. Her stillness was a wall, or perhaps a deep well. He shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking, a sound too loud in the immense quiet of the ridge. "My boy," he began, his voice cracking, raw. "Thomas, he's sick. The doctor," he faltered, shame and desperation warring in his eyes. "They say you—" He couldn't voice the word. Which, he didn't need to. It hung in the air between them, thick as the dust. Elara's gaze did not waver. It was not unkind, nor was it welcoming. It was simply observant. Like the hawk, seeing all without judgment, only truth, she remembered his face from the town, a face that had turned away when the whispers grew loudest, when the first stone struck her fence. He had been a symbol of the order that had excluded her, the law that had not protected her from their barbs. A memory surfaced, unbidden, a market day, years ago. She'd offered a woman, pale and trembling with childbed fever, a bundle of willow bark tea. The woman's husband, a burly man with fear in his eyes, had knocked it from her hand. "Get your devil's brew away from her." Sheriff Thorne had been nearby, talking to the blacksmith. He'd glanced over, frowned, then turned back to his conversation. The willow bark lay scattered in the dirt. The young woman had died a week later. Elara had gathered her herbs, her dignity, and retreated further into the silence of the ridge. Now, that same man stood at her door, his world crumbling. "He's dying," Thorne finally choked out, the words torn from him. "Please." The word was a raw wound. Elara looked past him, to the hazy outline of Havenwood in the valley below, a place of fear and forgetting. She saw the withered fields, the gaunt faces. She had felt their collective suffering, a dull ache in her own bones. But this was different. This was singular. A child. His child. Her silence deepened. It was not a refusal, not yet. It was a space where the unsaid things could breathe. His desperation was a palpable force, pressing against her. He expected a tirade, perhaps. Accusations. A demand for apology. She offered none. Her hands, resting on the rough wood of the doorframe, were still. They had soothed fevers before, coaxed life from barren soil. They had also built walls. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice low, like stones shifting in a dry stream bed. Not an accusation, but a genuine question. Thorne flinched. "There's no one else." A stark admission. The town's knowledge, its healers, its prayers, all had failed. He had come to the outcast, the pariah. "They call me witch," she stated. Not a question this time, but a simple fact. Her eyes held his, unwavering. She needed to see if he would flinch from that truth, standing here, asking for what he believed to be unholy aid. He swallowed, his gaze dropping for a moment to the dusty ground at his feet, then lifting again, stripped bare. "I don't care what they call you. I care about my son." The raw honesty of it cut through the layers of past hurt, of accumulated bitterness. This wasn't the sheriff speaking. This was a father. Elara felt a subtle shift within her, something ancient and deeply buried stirring. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a resonance. The universal grief of a parent fearing loss. She had known that fear once, a lifetime ago, a memory she kept locked away, wrapped in silence. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks, plunging the ridge into cooler shadow. The air grew still, expectant. Elara held his gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching, filled only with the rasp of his breathing and the distant sigh of the wind. She saw not the sheriff who had allowed her condemnation, but a man stripped to his essential fear, his essential love. This was a currency she understood, older than names, older than blame. "I make no promises," she said at last, her voice quiet but firm, each word deliberately placed. "No miracles." Her eyes, dark and deep as the spring water she guarded, searched his. "Only what the earth gives. Water, herbs, silence." Thorn nodded, a jerky, desperate movement. Anything. He was a drowning man grasping at a single thorny branch. He would take whatever terms she offered. Elara's gaze flickered towards the path leading down to Havenwood, then back to him. "I will not go there. To the town, to the place of whispers and stones. He must be brought here." A ripple of something? Dismay? Renewed fear? Crossed Thorn's face. To bring Thomas up this treacherous path, in his weakened state, and what would the town say? They already blamed her for the sickness that gripped them. To place the sheriff's son directly into the witch's hands would ignite a fresh pyre of outrage. But then he looked at Elara, at the quiet certainty in her stance, the utter lack of malice or triumph in her expression. She was not playing games. This was her way, her place. I understand," he managed, his voice hoarse. "When?" "At dawn," she replied. "The air is cooler then." She stepped back, a silent invitation for him to leave. He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, to offer thanks, or perhaps to plead again, but the words died on his lips. He simply nodded, turned, and began the descent, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his decision settling upon him. Elara watched him go, a dark figure swallowed by the growing twilight, until he was just a fading shape against the gloom of the valley. She closed her door, the sound a soft finality in the stillness. The news, when Marcus returned to Havenwood, spread like wildfire through dry grass. He didn't announce it, but his grim determination, his hushed conversation with Doc Weatherby, the preparations to move Thomas, it was enough. Outrage erupted, fueled by fear and generations of suspicion. Martha Higgins, whose son had the cough, accosted him outside the general store. "You can't, Sheriff. Taking him to her? It's a death sentence. She'll finish what she started." Others echoed her, their faces pale and angry in the flickering lantern light. "She's cursed us all." "You're condemning the boy," Marcus faced them, his exhaustion a visible cloak. "Doc Weatherby has done all he can," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Thomas is dying. If there is a spark of hope, even in the darkest place, I have to seek it." He offered no defense of Elara, no argument against their accusations. He simply stated his desperate truth. He would carry his son to the mountain. He would lay him at the feet of the woman they despised, because there was nowhere else to go. Back in her cabin, Elara moved with quiet purpose. She did not light a lamp, navigating by the faint starlight filtering through her small window and the deeper knowledge of her own space. She selected herbs from her drying racks, yarrow for fever, elderflower for sweat, plantain for its drawing power. She crushed dried leaves of comfrey, its scent earthy and strong. She took down a small, tightly woven basket and lined it with fresh moss, damp and cool from the shaded side of her cabin. Into this, she placed the herbs, each chosen with an almost reverent care. There was no incantation, no arcane ritual, only the wisdom of generations passed down through hands like hers, hands that knew the language of leaves and roots. She went to her hidden spring, the water bubbling softly from beneath a curtain of ferns, a secret song in the dry night. She filled a clay jug, the water cold and pure. This water, this lifeblood of the ridge, would be her primary tool. She carried a single smooth, dark river stone in her pocket, worn almost silken by years of touch. It was from a river that had flowed near her childhood home, a river that had sung a different song before loss had taught her the language of silence. Tonight, it felt cool and steady in her palm, an anchor. She prepared a space in the corner of her one room, a pallet of clean straw covered with a worn but spotless linen sheet, simple, unadorned. She wasn't preparing for a miracle. She was preparing for a vigil, for the long, quiet work of tending a fragile flame in a harsh wind. The moon, a sliver of bone, rose over the ridge. Ilara sat by her unlit hearth, waiting. The silence of her home was profound, yet alive. It was the silence of the earth breathing, of things growing and dying and being reborn. It was a silence the town below had forgotten how to hear. And into that silence, soon, a father's desperate hope would come. The journey up Blackwood Ridge, before dawn, was an ordeal etched in shadow and strained breath. Marcus Thorne carried Thomas wrapped in a thin blanket, the boy's small body a terrifyingly light burden. Each step on the loose rocky path was a gamble. Each stumble a jolt that elicited a faint moan from his son. Doc Weatherby had wanted to help, his face etched with concern, but Marcus had shaken his head. This was his burden, his choice. He would see it through alone. The air was cool, as Ilara had said, but thick with the scent of dust and dry pine, and underneath it, the faint damp aroma of the higher elevations, a smell almost forgotten in Havenwood. As they climbed, the town below receded, its few sputtering lights like dying embers. Up here, the stars seemed brighter, colder, indifferent. Thomas whimpered, his head lolling against Marcus's shoulder. "Hurts, Papa. Almost there, son. Almost there." Marcus's own lungs burned, his arms ached, but he pushed onward, driven by a primal urgency. He thought of the faces in the town, contorted with fear and anger. He thought of Maria, her silent, tear-streaked vigil. He had left her with a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Ilara's cabin emerged from the pre-dawn gloom, a darker shape against the dark bulk of the ridge. No light showed. For a terrifying moment, Marcus feared she had changed her mind, had vanished. Then the door opened. A sliver of deeper blackness, and her silhouette appeared. She said nothing, simply stepped aside, holding the door. He stumbled into the small interior, his eyes struggling to adjust. The air inside was surprisingly cool, smelling of earth and unfamiliar herbs, a clean, wild scent unlike anything in Havenwood. It was stark, simple, a rough table, a single chair, shelves holding clay pots and bundles of dried plants. In the corner, the pallet of straw and linen she had prepared. Ilara gestured towards it. Carefully, Marcus laid Thomas down. The boy seemed so small, so fragile against the rough simplicity of the setting. Ilara moved without a sound, fetching the jug of water and a soft cloth. She knelt beside Thomas, her face unreadable in the dim light. Marcus stood awkwardly, a large, useless presence in this quiet, purposeful space. He wanted to direct, to question, but the words wouldn't come. He was an intruder here, his authority, his knowledge, meaningless. He watched as Ilara gently bathed Thomas's forehead, his neck, his small, hot hands. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost reverent. She didn't speak to the boy, not in words. But there was a communication in her touch, a quiet understanding that seemed to bypass language. She dipped a corner of the cloth in water and moistened Thomas's cracked lips. He sighed, a tiny sound, and for a moment his brow seemed less furrowed. She then took a small clay bowl, mixed some of the dried herbs with a little water, creating a fragrant dark paste. With gentle fingers, she applied it to his temples, to the pulse points at his wrists. Her hands, gnarled and stained with earth, moved with an unexpected delicacy. Marcus saw them not as the claws of a witch, but as tools, worn and honed by long practice. A slow zoom, in his mind's eye, on those hands, sorting leaves, crushing petals, now tending his son with a focus so intense it was almost unnerving. He realized he was holding his breath. He let it out slowly. The silence in the cabin was profound, not an empty silence, but one filled with an unspoken tension, with the quiet labor of life fighting against dissolution. Ilara worked, and Marcus watched. He felt his carefully constructed world, his certainties, begin to crumble. Here, in this witch's hut, there was a dignity, a purpose, that shamed the frantic fear of the town below. Dawn began to paint the sky outside, filtering through the single small window, casting long, eerie shadows. Ilara showed no sign of fatigue. She was a figure of immense stillness, her concentration absolute. She offered Thomas a few sips of water from a tiny clay cup. He swallowed weakly. Marcus saw a bead of sweat trace a path down Alara's temple. She was not immune to the strain then. She was human, after all. The thought was a revelation. He wanted to ask, "What are you doing? What are those herbs?" But the words felt like sacrilege in the heavy silence. Her condition had been silence. He would honor it. He sank onto the rough floor near the door, his back against the cool stone wall, a silent sentinel to her vigil. The sun climbed higher, and the heat outside began to build. But inside the cabin, it remained surprisingly cool, the thick stone walls and the damp earth floor providing a natural insulation. Hours passed. Alara changed the cool cloths, reapplied the herbal paste, offered sips of water. Occasionally, she would simply sit beside Thomas, her hand resting lightly on his chest, as if listening to his very breath, to the faint rhythm of his struggling heart. Marcus watched, his initial fear slowly transmuting into a kind of awe. This was not sorcery. This was tending, ancient, elemental. The townsfolk were fools. He was a fool. The quiet triumph was not yet in sight, but a different kind of quiet had settled over him. The quiet of surrender, of placing his most precious hope into hands he had once, through his silence, condemned. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting slant of sunlight through the cabin's small window or the deepening shadows that heralded the cool of evening. Thomas's condition remained precarious, a fragile flame flickering in a relentless wind. Sometimes his fever would seem to lessen, his breathing would ease, and a desperate hope would flare in Marcus's chest, only to be doused when the heat returned, fiercer than before, and the boy's small body would tremble with renewed rigors. Through it all, Alara was a constant. She moved with an economy of motion, her focus unwavering. She slept little, catnapping in the single straight-backed chair, her head resting against the rough wall, always within earshot of the boy's slightest stir. Marcus watched her, the lines of exhaustion deepening around her eyes, the subtle tremor in her hands as she measured herbs or poured water. He saw not a witch, but a woman expending herself, pouring her own life force into the fragile vessel of his son. He offered to help, once. "Let me fetch water, or watch while you rest." She had looked at him, her eyes dark and unreadable. He needs stillness. The spring is particular. Her refusal was not unkind, but absolute. He understood. This was her domain, her rhythm. He was merely a witness. The silence persisted, broken only by Thomas's shallow breaths, the rustle of Alara moving, the occasional soft murmur she made, not to the boy, but to the herbs she prepared, as if coaxing them to yield their strength. It was not prayer, not incantation, but something akin to it, a deep, respectful communion with the natural world. During one long, breathless night, as Thomas's fever spiked alarmingly, Marcus found himself staring at Alara's face, illuminated by the faint moonlight. He saw a profound weariness there, but also an unyielding strength. And in that moment, a memory, sharp and painful, surfaced in Alara's mind, a scene she rarely allowed herself to revisit. It was not a grand tragedy, not a public burning or a dramatic confrontation. It was smaller, more intimate, and for that, perhaps more wounding. A small girl, her own daughter, Lilias, many, many years ago, before Havenwood, before the ridge. Lilias, with hair like spun moonlight and eyes full of laughter, struck down by a swift, inexplicable fever. Alara had known herbs then, too, the knowledge passed from her own mother. But the village elder, a stern man who distrusted any wisdom not his own, had forbidden her to tend her child. "It is God's will," he'd proclaimed. "Her remedies are of the old, wild ways." She had fought, pleaded, but they had held her back. Lilias had faded, her laughter silenced, while Alara watched, helpless, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. That loss had carved the solitude around her, had deepened her communion with the silent, knowing earth. It was not bitterness that drove her now, but a fierce, protective empathy. She would not let another child slip away if there was anything at all the earth could offer. She looked at Thomas, so small, so vulnerable, and saw Lilius. The memory did not weaken her, it focused her resolve. She redoubled her efforts, bathing his skin, murmuring quiet reassurances that perhaps only the air currents carried, but which seemed to soothe the troubled lines on his brow. Outside, the drought held its merciless grip. The wind whispered dry prophecies. One afternoon, a rumble of thunder echoed in the far distance, a hollow promise. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, teasing, then dissipated, leaving the sky a brazen, empty blue. Marcus felt his hopes sink with them. He looked at Alara. "Anything?" he'd asked, his voice a rough whisper. She didn't look up from where she was, gently massaging Thomas's small, limp hand with an infused oil. "Breathes," she replied. "Just that. He breathes." It was not a promise, but it was a truth. And in that stark, minimalist assessment, Marcus found a strange comfort. She was not offering false hope. She was offering presence, vigilance. The simple, profound act of staying. He began to see the patterns in her work, the cooling herbs when the fever was high, the strengthening ones when it receded slightly, the constant, gentle hydration. The way she seemed to listen to the boy's body, responding to its subtle shifts and cues, he realized, with a startling clarity, that this was not magic. This was an ancient, profound knowledge, a science woven from observation and empathy, a wisdom the world had forgotten in its rush for louder, quicker fixes. The days were a blur of sun and shadow, the nights a canvas of starlight and fear. And through it all, Ilara worked, a solitary figure tending a fragile spark, while a father watched, his world remade in the crucible of a small, silent room on a forgotten ridge. It was the 5th day, or perhaps the 6th. Time had lost its sharp edges, blurring into a continuous cycle of vigilance and exhaustion. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the dust motes, dancing in the single shaft of light from the window in hues of orange and rose. Thomas had been frighteningly still for hours. His breathing, so shallow Marcus had repeatedly crept closer, his heart hammering, just to reassure himself that the boy's chest still rose and fell. Ilara sat beside the pallet, her own stillness mirroring the child's, her eyes closed, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She seemed almost to be drawing strength from the earth beneath her, or perhaps lending her own. Suddenly, a small sound, a sigh, deeper than before. Thomas's eyelids fluttered. Not the frantic, fevered movement of before, but a slower, more deliberate opening. His gaze, clouded for so long, seemed to clear, just for a moment. He focused, vaguely at first, then, with a dawning awareness, on Alara's face. He blinked. Then, his gaze shifted, found Marcus, a flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible frown, as if trying to place him. Then, the faintest of smiles touched his cracked lips. "Papa?" The word was a mere breath, a thread of sound so fine Marcus thought he might have imagined it. But Alara's head had lifted, her eyes instantly alert, fixed on the boy. Marcus scrambled closer, his knees hitting the hard earth floor. "Thomas? Son?" Thomas's eyes, though still heavy, held a new clarity. He looked from Marcus to Alara, then back to Marcus. The fire in them, the delirious heat, had banked. It was replaced by a profound weariness, but also recognition. Alara leaned forward, her expression unreadable, yet intensely focused. She dipped a finger into the cup of water beside her and touched it to Thomas's lips. He licked them, a small, instinctive movement. She offered the cup. He sipped, a tiny, difficult swallow, then another. A tear escaped Marcus's eye, tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. He reached out a trembling hand, touched Thomas's forehead. It was still warm, but the raging heat had subsided. It was cooler, definitely cooler. Ilara watched, her face betraying nothing. No triumph, no elation, only a deep, quiet observation. She had seen this moment before, this fragile turning of the tide. She knew how easily it could turn back. But it was a change. A definite shift. Hope, cautious but insistent, unfurled in Marcus's chest, painful in its intensity. He wanted to weep, to shout, to grab Alara and thank her with a fervor that would shatter the cabin's silence. But he met her calm, steady gaze, and the words caught in his throat. He simply nodded, a gesture of immense, unspoken gratitude. She gave a slight inclination of her head in return, a silent acknowledgement. The moment stretched, precious and fragile. Thomas's eyes drifted closed again, but his breathing was deeper now, more regular. The terrible, rasping struggle had eased. He slept, a true sleep, not the tormented unconsciousness of before. News, it seemed, had a way of traveling on the wind, even from a place as isolated as Blackwood Ridge. Perhaps it was Doc Weatherby, who had made one anxious, silent visit to the foot of the path, his face a mask of worry, to whom Marcus had managed a shaky thumbs up from a distance. Or perhaps it was just the subtle shift in the atmosphere of dread that had hung over Havenwood for so long. But a whisper began to circulate in the dusty streets below. Not the usual condemnations of the witch, but something new, hesitant, a question. Could it be? Could she? The townsfolk who had been so quick to cast stones, so certain of her malice, now found themselves in an uncomfortable position. If the sheriff's son, given up for lost by conventional medicine, found healing at Alara's hands, what did that say about her? What did it say about them? A feather, a small downy thing from a sparrow or a wren, lay on the windowsill of the cabin. Alara had found it caught in a spiderweb earlier that morning and placed it there. A tiny, perfect piece of nature, a symbol of fragility, of flight, of life persisting. Now, in the fading light, it seemed to glow with a soft luminescence, a small sign, a turning point. The air in the cabin felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight of imminent loss had lifted, replaced by a tentative, breathless hope. The quiet triumph was not in a dramatic cure, but in this subtle shift, this gentle return from the brink. Thomas improved steadily over the next 2 days. The fever did not return with its former viciousness. He began to take more water, then a thin broth of herbs and wild greens Alara prepared. His voice, when he spoke, was weak but clear. He asked for his mother. He asked if his dog, Patches, was being fed. Small, ordinary questions that sounded like miracles to Marcus's ears. The sheriff, his own exhaustion immense but now buoyed by relief, watched his son's slow return to the world of the living with a gratitude so profound it left him speechless. He looked at Alara, who continued her quiet ministrations, her demeanor unchanged. She was neither celebratory nor aloof. She simply did what needed to be done, her movements economical, her presence a steady, calming influence. One afternoon, Thomas, propped up slightly on the pallet, pointed a thin finger towards the window. "Bird," he whispered, a smile touching his lips as a small finch landed briefly on the sill near the feather Alara had placed there. Alara, who was stirring something in a bowl, paused. A faint softness touched her own mouth. "Yes," she said. "It sings in the morning." It was the most she had said in days that wasn't a direct, minimal response to a question about Thomas. The shared observation, simple as it was, felt like a bridge across the silence. News of Thomas's marked improvement had solidified in Havenwood. The whispers of doubt about Alara's evil had grown into murmurs of reluctant wonder, then into outright speculation. The narrative was shifting. The witch who had cursed them was now, perhaps, a savior. A delegation arrived at the foot of Blackwood Ridge. Mayor Thompson, a man whose pronouncements usually carried the weight of undisputed fact, now looked hesitant, uncomfortable. With him were Mrs. Prockin, Henderson, whose cow had miraculously recovered from whatever ailment Alara had supposedly inflicted, and Jedediah Smith, the town's loudest proponent of the burn the witch sentiment, now looking sheepish and avoiding eye contact. Marcus met them on the path, some distance from the cabin, shielding Alara and Thomas from their intrusion. "Sheriff," Mayor Thompson began, clearing his throat. We heard the boy is doing better. He is, Marcus confirmed, his voice flat, his eyes hard. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, wringing her hands. It's a miracle, Sheriff. We never thought. Jedediah mumbled something that might have been an apology, his gaze fixed on his dusty boots. The town is grateful, Sheriff, the mayor continued, regaining some of his pomposity. Deeply grateful. And we were wondering, Ilara, if she might, well, with the drought and the sickness still lingering. He trailed off, the implication clear. They wanted her help. They wanted her back. They who had scorned her, stoned her, wished her dead, now sought her skills. Marcus felt a surge of cold anger. Their fickleness was breathtaking. He looked back towards the cabin, a silent, stoic presence against the harsh landscape. He thought of Ilara's unwavering dedication, her quiet dignity in the face of their hatred. She made no promises of miracles, Marcus said, his voice dangerously low. She offered water, herbs, and silence. The wells in Havenwood are dry because the rain has forgotten us, not because of her. Perhaps you should look to your own hearts for the source of your troubles. The mayor flushed. Mrs. Henderson looked stricken. Jedediah actually shuffled backward a step. Marcus turned his back on them, a clear dismissal, and walked back towards the cabin. He found Ilara outside, scattering seeds for the birds. She had heard, of course. Her hearing was as keen as any wild creature's. She didn't look at him, continued her task. They thirst, she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper to the wind. The wells are dry. Now they see water here. It wasn't a question expecting an answer. It was a statement of fact, layered with an ancient weariness, perhaps a touch of that dry, ironic wit she so rarely displayed. She scattered the last of the seeds. A small bird, bolder than the others, landed near her feet, pecking at the offering. Ilara watched it, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. The town wanted her back. They wanted her forgiveness, her skills, perhaps even her magic, now that it seemed to work in their favor. They expected her, perhaps, to be grateful for their change of heart, to embrace their sudden, convenient acceptance. But Ilara's gaze was not on Havenwood. It was on the bird, on the vast, indifferent sky, on the subtle stirrings of life in the parched earth around her. The expectation was reversed. She did not need their validation. Her triumph was not in their acceptance, but in her own unwavering adherence to her path, her own quiet knowing. The day came when Thomas was strong enough to make the journey back down the ridge. He was still thin, his face pale, but his eyes were bright, his small hand surprisingly firm in Marcus's. He stood by the cabin door, looking up at Ilara, who had a small bundle wrapped in cloth ready for them, some dried herbs for tea, a salve for his still tender skin. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice clear and true. He held out a small, clumsily carved wooden bird, something he must have whittled during his convalescence with Marcus's pocket knife. "For you." Ilara looked at the little bird, its wings uneven, its shape endearing in its imperfection. She took it, her gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle around the fragile wood. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a memory stirred. "It will watch the path," she said, her voice soft. She didn't say thank you in return, not in words, but her acceptance of the gift, the way she held it, was thanks enough. Marcus stood beside his son, his own gratitude a heavy, unspoken weight in his chest. He had tried to offer payment, money, supplies, anything. Ilara had refused with a silent shake of her head. Her price had been stillness, silence, and the courage to trust. He had paid it, and his son lived. "We owe you more than we can say, Ilara." She met his gaze, and for the first time he saw not the guarded outcast, but simply a woman, tired, yes, but with an immense, quiet strength. "Heal well, Thomas," she said, her eyes on the boy. Then she looked at Marcus. "The earth provides. Sometimes we only need to listen." She turned then and went back inside her cabin, closing the door softly behind her. There were no tearful farewells, no promises to visit, Just a quiet ending to a profound chapter. Marcus took Thomas's hand, and they began the slow descent. When they were halfway down, Marcus looked back. Elara was not visible. The cabin stood silent, watchful, already seeming to merge back into the rugged landscape. It was as if she had already retreated, her work done. The town received them with a mixture of awe, relief, and a lingering unease. They saw Thomas undeniably alive, undeniably better. They saw the sheriff, changed, his face etched with a new gravity. The mayor and his delegation had spread the word of Marcus's rebuff, and a shamefaced quiet had fallen over Havenwood. They wanted to make amends, to welcome Elara, to absorb her into their fold now that she had proven her worth in a way they could not deny. But Elara did not come. Days passed. The townsfolk would look up at Blackwood Ridge, at the small, distant shape of her cabin, wondering. Some said she was too proud. Others, that she was indeed a witch, content in her isolation. A few, a very few, began to understand. She had made her choice long ago. Her place was not with them, not in their fickle affections or their sudden gratitude. Her place was with the earth, with the silence, with the things that grew untended except by a knowing hand. Later that week, a lone rider, a trapper from the far territories, passed through Havenwood. He mentioned seeing a woman, solitary, walking west, towards the high plains, a small bundle on her back, her pace steady and unfaltering. He hadn't spoken to her. She had seemed, he said, complete in her solitude. Whether it was Elara, no one could be entirely sure. Her cabin on the ridge, when someone finally ventured up, was empty, spotless. A single smooth river stone sat on the windowsill, beside the small carved wooden bird Thomas had left. It was as if she had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the faintest scent of herbs and the deep silence of the mountain. Her triumph was not in being accepted by the town, but in her unwavering agency, her quiet self-possession. She had come when asked, tended a life, and then, when the world clamored for her, she had chosen her own path, as silent and resolute as the ancient stones of the ridge. She hadn't needed their redemption. Perhaps, in some small way, she had offered them a chance at their own. Havenwood did not forget Elara. Thomas, growing stronger each day, was a living testament to the woman on the ridge. He carried no fear of her name, only a quiet respect. He would often look up at the empty cabin, a thoughtful expression on his young face. The small wooden bird she had kept sat on his own windowsill now, a reminder of silence, of healing, of a wisdom that lay beyond the town's understanding. The drought did not break immediately. The sun still beat down, the earth remained parched, but something had shifted in Havenwood. The easy blame, the quick condemnation had lessened. When a well ran dry, they dug deeper, together. When sickness came, they helped each other with a new, humbler spirit. The fear that had twisted them into finding a scapegoat had been replaced by a quiet introspection. They had been wrong, terribly wrong. And the proof of it walked among them, a boy whose laughter once again echoed in the dusty streets. Sheriff Marcus Thorne was a changed man. The weight of his star felt different now, less a burden of authority, more a reminder of responsibility, of the fallibility of judgment. He spoke little of Elara, but when he did, it was with a reverence that silenced any lingering whispers. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she had not been a witch, but a healer, a woman of profound, misunderstood knowledge. He often found himself looking towards Blackwood Ridge, towards the empty cabin that stood like a quiet monument. He wondered where she had gone, if she had found peace. He hoped so. He hoped she had found a place where the earth was kind, where the water flowed freely, and where the silence was filled only with the songs of birds and the rustle of leaves. One evening, as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of purple and gold, a different kind of breeze stirred the air. It was cooler, carrying the scent of distant moisture. Dark clouds, heavier than any they had seen in seasons, began to gather on the horizon, not teasing this time, but advancing with a slow, majestic purpose. A hush fell over Havenwood. People stepped out of their homes, their faces turned upwards, a mixture of hope and disbelief in their eyes. Then, the first drop fell, and another, and another. Soon, a steady, soaking rain was falling on the thirsty land, drumming on the rooftops, gurgling in the dry creek beds, washing the dust from the weary leaves. It was as if the sky itself was weeping, a cleansing, healing rain. Children ran out into it, laughing, their faces upturned to the gift from above. Old folks stood on their porches, tears mingling with the raindrops on their cheeks. Marcus stood with Maria and Thomas, watching the downpour. Thomas smiled, a wide, joyful grin. Marcus put his arm around his wife, his gaze drawn, once more, to the distant, rain-swept ridge. He thought of Ilara, wherever she was. He hoped she could feel the rain, too. Perhaps the land itself, having witnessed a small act of redemption, of understanding, had finally decided to offer its own. The rain fell for 3 days, and when it stopped, Havenwood was transformed. The dust was settled, the air was clean, and a faint tinge of green was already beginning to show on the long-suffering earth. The wells began to fill. The creek began to sing its stony song once more. They never saw Ilara again, but her presence lingered, a quiet echo in the renewed landscape, in the changed hearts of the people. She had asked for nothing, promised little, and given back a life. In doing so, she had given Havenwood a chance to find its own way back to grace. The quiet triumph was not just hers, but theirs too, in the lessons learned, in the hope rekindled, in the rain that finally came. And so you see, some wounds mend in silence, tended by hands the world too quickly names. The earth remembers, the water always finds its way. And a life, given back, can sometimes teach a whole town to look up and pray for a different kind of rain.